Hello out there. My name is David Horton, and I'm proud to be on the pastor team at St. Luke's Methodist here in Houston. I serve Gethsemane, our incredible campus in Southwest Houston. Friends, welcome to this little daily devotional. Thanks for joining me. It's gorgeous out here in Houston. My kid just got out of that little kiddie pool in the background. I've heard the neighbor kids behind me playing in their pool. Honestly, I literally just put on this button down because you deserve more than a t-shirt, okay? You deserve a button down. Thank you for being with me today. Friends, I want to kick off the week by talking about grief. Grief. We're all grieving a lot right now. Grief, when we name grief, what we're about to do in just a moment, when we name grief, it's powerful, okay? It does a lot. I think God works through our grief. I don't think God causes the reasons for our grief, but God definitely works through our response to grief. Grief is the normal response to any kind of loss. Grief is normal. It's completely normal. It's completely normal to feel anger, fear, confusion, sadness, deep sadness, feeling like you don't know what to do or where to go, or even apathy, numbness. All those are normal grief responses. And grief is the response to any loss. The loss of a loved one, of course, but really any loss can make you grieve. In fact, a good rule of thumb is if you don't grieve something when you lose it, that means you didn't love it in the first place. Grief is a normal response to losing anything or anyone we love. So what I want to do right now, I want you to participate in this, okay? You're going to be raising your hand a lot in the next few minutes. I'm going to name 21 things that we are grieving during COVID-19. There's no rhyme or reason behind the 21 number. It's just a number of things I could come up with today. These are 21 things that we're grieving in this season. You probably don't grieve all of these things, but I bet you grieve more than one. And if this is something, when I say one of these and you grieve along with me in one of these things, then I want you to raise your hand, okay? So here we go. Raise your hand if you lost the chance to see children or grandchildren. Raise your hand if you couldn't celebrate your birthday with people who don't live with you. Raise your hand if you missed your graduation. Raise your hand if you miss your teacher. Raise your hand if you miss your coworkers. Raise your hand if you miss the job you used to have. Raise your hand if you couldn't see your mom on Mother's Day. Raise your hand if you couldn't go to a concert or a show. Raise your hand if you couldn't go to a funeral. Raise your hand if you couldn't go to a wedding. Raise your hand if you've had to delay your wedding. Raise your hand if you've lost someone in the past 2 months. Raise your hand if you miss shaking hands. Raise your hand if you miss hugs. Raise your hand if you miss going to church. Raise your hand if you miss potlucks and parties. Raise your hand if you miss feeling safe in a crowd. Raise your hand if you miss not second-guessing going to a restaurant. Raise your hand if you miss the normal you took for granted. Raise your hand if you miss seeing the face behind the face mask. Raise your hand if you miss the innocence you didn't know you had. If you raised your hand to any of those things, that means you loved it. And grief is the normal response to losing something or someone you love. Let me close with this. This comes from Mark chapter 16, verses 1 and 2. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome bought spices, so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. Of course, we read that on Easter morning. We forget that the women who went to the tomb on Easter morning, they were going to a funeral. They were going to resume the funeral on Sunday morning that had been interrupted on Friday afternoon because of the Sabbath. And you couldn't work on the Sabbath, including go to a funeral, plan a funeral. They went to the tomb. They went to grieve. They went to confront their loss. They went to name their loss, like we've just done. There's power in naming your losses. See, these women who go to the tomb to confront their loss, they're the first to see the resurrection, to feel the hope of resurrection. It's when you don't deny the truth of your grief that you feel the hope of resurrection. And it's when you do deny the truth of your grief that sometimes you do miss out on the hope of resurrection. So friends, in this season, today, this week, for the rest of this COVID-19 outbreak, don't be afraid to face your grief. Don't be afraid. Take heart and have the courage to call it what it is, a real loss. And then, well, you'll be standing outside the empty tomb. Amen.